Good evening and welcome to Education Number One Priority. Topic of conversation. Well, the 84th legislative session ended, as we know, in May. Several legislative bills came forward, and many of those already went into effect and some are to be. We already had Representative Todd Hunter, who went over the session, and now we have Representative Herrero, who will try to visit with us in terms of what's transpired, what's on the forefront, and what will be happening in 2017. Welcome to Education Number One Priority.
Hello, Dr. Garza. How are you doing?
I'm fine. How about yourself?
Doing well. Thank you.
Well, very good. First, let's just talk about you. You've already been in the legislature, what, 5 terms?
5, right.
5 terms. What keeps you motivated to do this?
You know, believing that I have continued to be able to do something to help people. Being a state representative, in my opinion, is one of a position of serving. And so as a public servant, I feel that as long as I am effective in being able to represent the district and the surrounding area, that I will continue to do this, obviously, as long as people want me to represent them in the Texas legislature. So, you know, the passion, the commitment, the desire to help and serve people is what keeps me going. And obviously the support and help of individuals that have voted me into office, but also my family and friends of mine that realize that session means 140 days, you know, every odd-numbered year, and so, you know, raising 5 kids, you know, at home and making sure that they still go to school is a difficult task. So I'm extremely grateful to my wife and thankful for her willingness to allow me to serve. So, you know.
And it really is a service, because I don't know if people realize it or not. It is not a high-paying job, is it?
It pays $600 a month is what the salary is for a state representative. And, you know, those that serve, like myself, we don't do it for pay. We do it because we want to help people. And so we've been fortunate enough that through the great staff that we've had and the assistance of individuals and the great delegation that we have, you know, working with Chairman Todd Hunter and State Senator Juancho Hinojosa, that collectively we've been able to serve our constituents well.
And we're going to be talking about that, because that does make a big difference.
It does.
We're working in partnership and in collaboration, no matter what the party is, for the interest of the people.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Well, I know you're the chair of the Committee of Criminal Jurisprudence. What is that?
Criminal jurisprudence, long story short, it's laws that affect the criminal justice system. So whether you're talking about mandatory sentences or you're talking about bonds that are issued for certain violations of the law, those are all issues that typically will come to the Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence. And so that's the committee on the House side. We have the correlating committee on the Senate side. And so the bills that we deal with, you know, in some cases are directly impact the district that I represent, District 34. By example, the Women's Shelter, for example, brought to me the proposal of Mary's Law to allow for GPS monitoring of individuals that continue to threaten the lives of survivors in domestic violence situations. And so this was a legislation that was passed, and since then to now we continue to work with the Women's Shelter on trying to eradicate domestic violence, you know, once and for all from our communities, our families, and our lives.
That was a success. Let me ask you this. How many bills did y'all look at? How many did you bring forth? Because I know they have to go through the Senate and the House, and then they're finally acted upon.
Yeah, the committee per se, we heard over 300 bills. I know in general terms there were about 6,200 bills that were filed, and about 1,300 were actually passed, and of those 41 the governor vetoed. So there's a lot of legislation that is considered There's only one bill that we're required as a legislative body to consider and to pass, and that's a balanced budget. But beyond that, obviously there's priorities that come up that we address through the form of legislation, and some of them are able to see the beginning and end and become effective bills and laws, and others, are deliberated more in the committee process and sometimes are requiring more time than what is allowed under the legislative regular session of 140 days. And so
yeah, but much is accomplished in that. And I think what people don't realize, and you and I will be visiting, is that even though a bill may not make it on calendar and on the floor, it could come back up. And sometimes it takes 3 or 4 sessions before it's acted upon, but it does get through. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's more rare that you see a bill that's filed with no prior work done on it and filed in a legislative session that it actually go through the process and become effective law. So the norm is more of constant review and debate of an issue. By example, the no texting and driving has been filed repeatedly over sessions, and that is a bill that I support, that we should not text and drive. And unfortunately, it hasn't been able to make it through the process. And so, time will tell, if that day were to come, but it doesn't prevent the authors of those legislative bills to continue to work on those issues that are important to them and their constituents.
Yeah, and to listen on why it's not making, what's occurring, what are those things, because that helps then bring it forth and say, okay, how do we rethink this and what do we need to do? But we had some really top legislative wins in South Texas. And I know I visited with Representative Todd Hunter in a previous program, but I want to talk about them again because there really were wins for us. And so let's visit about those. Windstorm was one of those.
Windstorm was one of those that we all collectively, understand why there was something that needed to be done. And the difficult part to that was trying to convince other members of the legislative body that don't represent the coastal communities why it is a state issue as opposed to just a coastal bend issue. And we were successful over numerous sessions to eventually come up with a bill that we believe will make the reforms necessary to ensure that that the Texas Windstorm Insurance Board is responsive of the needs and priorities of residents that live along the coast, and that the state as a whole realizes the importance that the coastal communities play in making sure that Texas has a great economy as we have so far. So, the legislative reforms to windstorm insurance make it so that it's more consumer friendly, and so, we will keep our fingers crossed and hope that the results are what we anticipated them to be, and that's, more favorable to consumers. And so that's one of the bills. The other bill that we worked on worked with the city of Corpus Christi. I know we were talking to individuals with the Visitors Bureau as well, and so one of the issues that came to us from the city of Corpus Christi and Port Aransas was to be able to retain more of the funds that are raised from hotel occupancy stays here in Corpus, to actually have that money stay in Corpus to be used to make improvements and maintain beach beautification efforts. And so we were successful in doing that as well. So City of Corpus will stand to gain millions of dollars that will help offset some of the costs associated with maintaining our beautiful beaches that serve to attract visitors to Corpus Christi. So that's another issue that will help. Making sure that we have economic development. We work with the Port of Corpus Christi to make sure that the Port of Corpus was able to have now the ability to issue overweight and oversized permits. So that'll help the port expand on its abilities to export some of the product that is either refined or created or manufactured here in Texas. And so that's another economic benefit that helps our community as a whole. So numerous bills that we were able to work on. One that we worked with Senator Hinojosa was the Cameron Espinosa bill. Some of you may recall that Cameron Espinosa was a junior high middle school student who, during a football practice, was bitten by fire ants and had a severe allergic reaction and unfortunately passed. But in an effort to try to avoid situations like that from occurring again, Senator Hinojosa and the entire delegation worked on passing the Cameron Espinosa Act that now would allow for epinephrine auto-injectors in our schools across the state so that if there is a student that suffers, or any individual for that matter that suffers an allergic reaction, those medicines would be readily available to help prevent another fatality, as was the case with Cameron Espinosa. So it was labeled as Senate Bill 66 in honor and memory of Cameron Espinosa's football jersey number. And so that was another legislative effort that collectively we were able to help not only Cameron Espinosa's family, but also obviously anyone else across the state that would go through something like that again. So we hope to provide some help in those matters. So other legislation that we worked on collectively on the budget, for example, through the efforts of Senator Hinojosa and all of us that worked, we were able to bring $9 million for the Texas State Aquarium on its expansion project, working on the Defense Economic Adjustment grants for cities like Corpus Christi, for example, that have the Army Depot and the Naval Air Station, to help communities like Corpus Christi to have infrastructure and improvements that will help further show to the federal government that communities like Corpus Christi and the surrounding area are favorable and receptive of our military. And so those are efforts that the state understands that need to be assisted along the way, for example, our communities. And so that was another form of benefit that we were able to provide for our community. So different programs, different legislative efforts that collectively all of us in working really with all of you through emails and individuals that went up to Austin to express opposition, support on many of the legislative issues that we had as a delegation proved to be successful. And so we're grateful to everybody and all of our staff that worked countless hours to make sure that everything that needed to be done was actually done. So it was a great session for our community.
I didn't want to interrupt you at all because I wanted our listening audience to hear on the successes, but you left out two. Texas A&M University, both Corpus Christi and Kingsville. And the reason I say that is because I know, as a South Texan, I'm very proud of all that has been accomplished in every one of them. Right. And when you talked about the windstorm, I think it's important for our listening audience to realize that, yes, legislation has passed, but we still do not know what the outcomes of that's going to be, right?
Right, that's right.
They're still in the works, because sometimes people say, oh, good, I'm going to get relief immediately.
Yeah.
And that's just not going to happen at this point until we know exactly the design that's going to be. Right.
Yeah, the legislative effort is policy. Right. And then from that, you have the state agencies that actually have to carry out and implement those policies. And so, in making sure as a legislative branch that those policies are actually carried through as intended, we look for responses from you to say, hey, yeah, y'all got it right on that one, and, it is having the effect that you intended. And if there isn't something that is working the way it should, or it needs to be better refined, then, let us know so that we can go back next legislative session and work on that. But the A&M Corpus, for example, I know that we worked on bringing additional funds for the engineering programs at Corpus Christi, and so that's an ongoing, continuing, successful program that has proven to be a great benefit to the university. And so, when we talk about higher education, both A&M Corpus and A&M Kingsville are great institutions that help serve our residents, and so we do everything that we can to help those respective institutions, because education is a priority. And so, that is yet another point where we were able to restore some of the funding for public education. And so we look forward to continuing to do more for public education.
Well, I think, again, as a South Texan, we have Texas A&M, Corpus Christi, and Kingsville both within, 45 minutes of each other. So we're very, very blessed and lucky to have both of those.
That's correct.
And I know there were some building funds available for both, and I know they both were elated about that. So how was all this accomplished?
Really, it's through hard work of constituents and then also of our delegation. We were able to work collectively, both Chairman Hunter and I and State Senator Juancho Hinojosa. We all understand that it's not about Republican or Democrat. It's about representing our constituents, and being able to do that work is what we love to do. And so we help each other in multiple issues, in working on a certain legislative issue, or helping on the back microphone, talking to chair people of respective committees to ensure that we all stay on message about why this issue is a priority to the constituents that we represent, and we all work extremely well. We communicate. Our staff is constantly in contact with one another, and so Todd and I text each other, Senator Hinojosa as well, and so we see each other as individuals that collectively, not only are we friends, but we understand the importance that we have to represent our constituents, and so that is our priority for all of us. And so having a great delegation helps in being able to do well for our constituents.
And chairing the committees that not only you chair, plus of course the calendar committee by Representative Todd Hunter, and of course Senator Chuy Hinojosa as well. So it was a great delegation, and South Texas did do very well. So thank you so very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Garza.
Senate Bill 11. Mm-hmm. Okay, that one I know you've probably already gotten some phone calls, people are talking about, and that's the one that talks about handguns on campuses. And I know that's not going to take effect until, what, 2017?
Right.
But what's in the forefront on that one?
Well, I mean, obviously there was advocates that were wanting to allow campus carry is what it's often referred to as, and so the provisions of that bill allow individuals that have a concealed handgun license to actually bring those firearms on to public institutions, both universities and community colleges. The provisions of that will take effect later. The provisions allow for the university to set some parameters, for example, on buildings that would be allowed to have concealed handgun licensed individuals to actually bring those firearms into those specific rooms or classrooms or certain settings. One thing that is common as to all is that no one, whether they've got a concealed handgun license or not, would be able to carry those firearms onto the public schools that are held or actually taught on universities or child care facilities, for example. Those are provisions that under the statute would not allow an individual to carry a firearm. So we heard from both sides, to be honest with you. We heard from advocates that wanted the law passed. We also heard from some professors that said that that it would be difficult to try to recruit others to come to the universities or junior colleges if this was the law, and so we'll see how that plays out and see what kind of responses we get from people about did it help or did it not help, and what kind of responses we get from that. And so, and the other thing is we look for any unintended consequences. Was there something that we didn't consider when it was being debated?
Okay. Well, I already read in the newspaper recently that you have a couple of professors from top universities that have already said they're going to be resigning at the end of 2016 because of the unknown factors. Right. And again, like you say, it's passed. It's not going to be implemented to 2017. We'll see what transpires. Now, let's talk about legislation that didn't get through.
Right.
What pieces of legislation didn't go through that, number one, you look at and say, gee, I wish they had, or they'll be probably coming up again? You mentioned the texting as one.
Yeah, the no texting and driving is one. There was one that local officials, law enforcement officials, were wanting to see if they could have the ability to, if they were to get called for jury duty, they have the ability to say that they were not able to do so because of work, for example, or because they had just come off of the graveyard shift. And so that was a bill that we were successful in passing on the House, but it got held up on the Senate side. So that's one that I think that local law enforcement officials are going to be interested in pursuing again. Other legislation dealt with funding some of the unmanned drone projects, for example. Right. I know that there was some money that was asked of the universities that didn't get fully funded, so I know that Chairman Hunter, myself, and Chuy Hinojosa are working even in the interim to try to see if there's some funding that we can have for that program, because it's proven to be successful not only for the state of Texas in recruiting jobs and research companies and individuals, but also in just having the university be able to work on those projects with other individuals and making sure that becomes more used than it has in the past. And when it comes to flooding, for example, in Wimberley and some of these other areas that we've been hit hard across the state that become inaccessible for individuals or the common type of vehicle. These unmanned drones, for example, have been very successful in being able to access those areas and show footage of whether or not there's actually anyone there that needs to be rescued, or what kind of the terrain is, or what the circumstances are. So that's another legislative effort that that we hope to work on. Fully restoring funds for public education remains a constant issue that while we restored some of those funds, we're still lacking short of where those funds were prior to the 2011 budget deficit reductions that were made. And so making sure that we fully restore funding for public education is also an ongoing issue that I am adamant about, that we need to continue to provide the funding and the resources necessary to ensure that our teachers have the resources necessary to succeed, and that our students are able to learn as best they can.
Well, now that you mentioned legislation, I have a question, and I was going to save it toward the end, but I'm going to bring it up now. 45 out of the 50 states have some kind of litigation going on because of inequity in state funding. State of Texas was in the courts once before. Now the state of Texas is back in the courts, and we're waiting to see what's going to happen, because Judge Dietz had already ruled that, number one, public education is inequitable as it is. And so now the Supreme Court is looking at it. 45 out of 50. Does that not tell us something about the way education is being funded, and how do we keep equity in education through the dollars?
No, I agree with Judge Dietz. I think that the system as set up now is inequitable, because you have affluent school districts that have the resources necessary to ensure that they have not only the teachers there, but also the resources necessary to teach to a student as opposed to teaching to a test. Right. And so the way we get to that is that the state of Texas has to make public education a priority. Okay. We have to provide the funds necessary in our classrooms so that our teachers have the resources to teach, that they are able to rely on different programs that they know are most effective with the students that they have in their actual classrooms. Not by continuing to put these marks that we want teachers to pass, but not providing the resources necessary to actually achieve that goal is difficult, if not impossible. And so in order to make sure that we get to that point where every child, regardless of where they attend school, receives a first-class quality education, is we as a state have to make funding of public education a priority. And so we made some strides toward that, but more still needs to be done so that we can actually provide the necessary tools and resources in our classrooms for our school teachers, for them. And so that's, taking it away from the judicial branch, right, and doing what we as a legislative body are constitutionally required to do is where I think that we need to be, that we haven't been there yet. So. Yeah.
And that's going to be a challenge, is it not?
It will be, especially because this last legislative session, I know, for example, I was one of those that was advocating that we use the funds that were there readily available, not expended, that we apply those towards public education. And the response that I got from individuals that were not in support of that idea was, no, let's not do that, because we haven't heard from the judiciary. It could be that the Supreme Court says that what we've done up to date is actually satisfactory, and that we don't, as a legislative body, have to act on this. And I said, how can you say that with a straight face if you know already that Judge Dietz and even the Supreme Court ruling from previously has said that unless the legislative body does something more for public education, that they foresee that the issue of equitability is going to be held to be unconstitutional, because you have a disparity between those that are in more affluent schools and those that are not, that they're not receiving the same quality education. And so we as a state have to make sure that with this growing population that tends to be Hispanic, that we make sure that we educate all of them, because everyone in our public schools, because it will be an issue that we will have to deal with as a state later if we have an undereducated population. And so it's better that we invest now in our public schools, help our students to learn and to succeed so that we can continue to grow and prosper as a state as we have.
Well, they're waiting for the court's decision, 45 out of 50. So really in 2017, the Texas legislature could become a leader in that and show the other 44 how to fund education, right?
I hope so.
And that could be
I
a
hope
model.
so, Dr.
Really
Because we expect that decision from the Supreme Court will come probably before the next legislative session.
Okay. Well, just so people know, even though right now you're not in session, there are committees that are going on, people are working, and so therefore, yes, one session has ended, but we've got interim committees that are coming and more that are coming in 2016, and so the work is already beginning for 2017, right?
That's exactly right. In fact, we've already talked to some people about ideas for the next legislative session that starts in January of 2017, and so the work begins already, and the homework, and in trying to talk to people and learn more about those issues.
Well, what I'm going to do in the next session is bring both you and Representative Todd Hunter so we can talk about how we're going to get ready for 2017.
That sounds good.
So we can continue to do the great things that were done this past session.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for being here. Appreciate it so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Dr.
Well, as you've heard, the legislative session has completed. The 84th, planning for the 85th is beginning. And this has been Education #1 Priority, and I'm Dr. Mary Jane Garza.